There was a time when I believed that the strongest walls were the ones people could see. The distance, the silence, the hesitation before every honest sentence. I thought those were the things protecting me. I was wrong. The strongest walls were never visible. They lived much deeper than behavior. They existed inside the way I processed the world, inside the quiet rules I never spoke out loud, rules that became so natural I stopped noticing they were there. Never let anyone become part of your thinking. Never allow another person's perspective to settle so deeply that it begins influencing your own. Never confuse understanding with permanence. And, above all, never give someone's presence enough space that their absence could reshape the architecture of your mind. Those rules never felt restrictive. They felt intelligent, practical, necessary. After all, people leave, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally. Sometimes they remain exactly where they've always been, but the version of them you knew slowly disappears. I've watched it happen more times than I care to remember. Not because people are dishonest, because people change. Life changes them, time changes them, fear changes them, even happiness changes them. Nothing stays untouched forever. That's why I learned to build my inner world around things that couldn't disappear, IDs, Bartals, questions, the quiet rhythm of my own thoughts. Those things never walked away. They never became strangers. They remained exactly where I left them. Reliable, predictable, safe. For a long time, that was enough. More than enough. I never felt incomplete. I never searched for someone to fill a space inside me because I had never created that empty space to begin with. Everything I needed existed internally, or at least that's what I believed. Looking back now, I don't think I was lying to myself. I think I simply hadn't experienced the kind of presence capable of challenging that belief. Because beliefs aren't tested by agreement, they're tested by exceptions. And every certainty I've ever carried eventually met one. This was mine. The strange part is, you never arrived like an exception. You arrived like something ordinary. So ordinary that I barely noticed the beginning. No dramatic first impression, no unforgettable moment, no conversation that immediately separated itself from all the others. If someone asked me when everything changed, I genuinely couldn't answer. Because change like this doesn't happen in moments. It happens in accumulation. A sentence here, a silence there, a realization too small to acknowledge, then another, until one day you wake up and realize your internal landscape has quietly rearranged itself while you weren't paying attention. That's the frightening thing about subtle transformations. They don't ask permission. They happen underneath awareness, and by the time you notice, they've already become part of who you are. At first, I dismissed everything. I always do. Not because I'm skeptical of people, because I'm skeptical of conclusions. The human mind has an extraordinary talent for inventing meaning where none exists. Coincidences become destiny, attention becomes affection, comfort becomes certainty. I've seen people mistake temporary emotion for lifelong truth. I've watched entire relationships collapse because they were built on interpretations instead of reality. I promised myself long ago that I would never make that mistake. Every feeling deserved examination. Every assumption deserved resistance. Every unusual connection deserved time. So that's exactly what I gave this. Time. I waited for the illusion to disappear, for familiarity to become ordinary, for curiosity to fade, for the mind to return to its usual balance. But something unexpected happened. Nothing faded, nothing weakened. If anything, it became quieter, and somehow that made it stronger. People often believe intensity is proof of importance. I don't. Intensity burns quickly. Anything that relies on constant emotional energy eventually exhausts itself. The things that truly matter don't demand attention every second. They become part of the background, so constant, you stop noticing they're there. Like gravity. You don't think about gravity every morning, yet every movement depends on it. That's what your presence slowly became. Not excitement, not obsession, a constant, something my mind quietly accounted for without asking whether it should. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with emotion anymore. I was dealing with integration. There's a difference. Emotion visits, integration stays. Emotion rises and falls. Integration changes the system itself. Imagine adding one new note to a piece of music. At first, it seems insignificant, just another sound among many. But if that note changes the harmony, suddenly every other note relates to it differently. The entire composition transforms because of something almost invisible. That's how this felt. Nothing about my life looked different, yet everything sounded different internally. I found myself asking questions from angles I'd never considered, seeing possibilities I normally would have ignored. Even disagreement began feeling different, not because I wanted approval, because I had become aware that another perspective existed which wasn't competing with mine, it was expanding it. Expansion is dangerous, not because growth is dangerous. Because growth removes certainty. Once your perspective expands, you can never honestly return to seeing the world the smaller way again. That's irreversible. Maybe that's why people resist change so fiercely. Not because change hurts, because it makes old certainty impossible. I think I've been resisting that more than I realized. Not you. The implications of you, those are very different things. You, as a person, never asked anything from me, never demanded explanations, never insisted on closeness, never tried to become important. If anything, your presence carried an unusual absence of pressure. There was no urgency, no invisible expectation hiding underneath every interaction, just space, real space, the kind that doesn't suffocate simply because another person occupies it. That's incredibly rare. Most people don't actually give space. They give temporary freedom while quietly waiting for you to become who they expect. It's subtle, almost impossible to notice, until one day you realize you've been adjusting yourself without knowing why. I've experienced that before. Maybe you have too. Someone says they accept you. But over time, their reactions begin teaching you which parts of yourself receive warmth and which parts receive silence. Eventually, you start editing yourself automatically. Not because they asked you to, because your nervous system learned what feels safe. That's not acceptance. That's adaptation. Real acceptance doesn't require editing. It allows existence, exactly as it is. You never rewarded certain parts of me more than others. You never seemed interested in creating a better version of me. You interacted with what already existed without trying to improve it, without trying to simplify it, without trying to solve it. Do you realize how unusual that is? Most people can't witness complexity without trying to organize it. It's almost instinctive. We label things to reduce uncertainty. We define people so they become easier to predict. We summarize entire human beings into a handful of characteristics because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. You never rushed toward certainty. You seemed strangely comfortable not knowing everything. Ironically, That's probably why you noticed more than anyone else ever has, because certainty ends observation. The moment we believe we understand someone, our attention begins fading, we stop discovering, we start confirming. We only notice things that support the version of them we've already created inside our heads. Maybe that's why genuine understanding is so rare. It requires remaining curious even after familiarity arrives. Most people never do that. You somehow did, without trying, without announcing it, without even realizing the difference. I think that's what stayed with me more than anything else. Not what you understood, how you understood. There was no performance in it, no desire to prove perception, no subtle satisfaction in being right about me. You simply observed, as though observation itself was enough. That changed something inside me, because for the first time, being understood didn't feel like exposure. It felt peaceful. I've spent years believing those two experiences were inseparable, that if someone truly understood me, I'd automatically feel vulnerable, guarded, uncomfortable. Instead, I felt quieter, lighter, not because anything became easier, because nothing needed defending anymore. That's unfamiliar territory for someone like me. When you've spent years protecting your internal world, you eventually forget what it feels like to simply exist inside it with another person nearby. No performance, no explanation, no strategy, just existence. And the strange thing is, I don't remember deciding to trust you. Trust usually feels deliberate. This didn't. It felt accidental, like setting something down for just a moment, then realizing hours later you never picked it back up. That's how my defenses disappeared, not dramatically, absent-mindedly, quietly enough that I never noticed the exact moment they stopped standing between us. Maybe that's why I keep returning to this in my mind. Not because I'm searching for answers, because I'm searching for the process. I want to understand how something so significant happened without announcing itself. How someone became woven into my awareness without crossing any visible boundary. How my internal world made room for another presence without asking permission from the part of me that usually controls access. Perhaps that's the answer itself. Perhaps the deepest changes never ask permission. Perhaps they happen below language, below intention, below decision. Perhaps the soul recognizes long before the mind creates explanations. And maybe that's why some people don't feel new when they arrive. They feel remembered. Not because you've met them before, but because something essential about them speaks a language your inner world has been fluent in all along. If that's true, then maybe this was never about finding someone. Maybe it was about finally recognizing a frequency that had always existed, waiting patiently until two lives happened to become quiet enough to hear it. There's something unsettling about realizing that a person has become part of your internal world before you ever intended to make room for them. Not because they demanded that space, not because they slowly convinced you to lower your guard, but because one day you notice your thoughts moving differently, and somewhere inside those movements, they're already there. I've tried to understand how that happens, not emotionally, structurally, because everything meaningful follows a structure. Even chaos has one. It simply hides it better. For most of my life, I believed that every connection had a predictable rhythm. People meet, they learn each other, they build trust, they create memories. Eventually, those memories become the foundation for closeness. That's the order that made sense to me. It was logical, safe, understandable. Then you arrived, and somehow the order reversed itself. There was recognition before familiarity, understanding before explanation, comfort before certainty, as though the foundation existed long before either of us realized we were standing on it. I still don't know what to call that. Maybe it doesn't need a name. Maybe naming something too early only limits what it's allowed to become. That's another thing you've quietly changed inside me. I used to believe every meaningful experience needed a conclusion, a definition, a place to belong. Now I'm beginning to wonder if definitions are sometimes just smaller containers for things too large to fit inside them. Some experiences aren't confusing because they're unclear. They're confusing because they're unusually clear. So clear, they don't resemble anything you've experienced before. The mind searches for comparison. It looks through old memories, hoping to find something familiar, something it can point toward and say, this is just like that. But sometimes there is no comparison, no previous chapter, no earlier version. Only something entirely new. That's where I've been living lately. Not inside uncertainty. Inside unfamiliar certainty. I know this matters. I just don't know why it matters the way it does, and maybe that's the hardest part. I've always trusted reason, not because emotion lacks value, because reason gives shape to things that otherwise drift endlessly. But reason keeps arriving at the same conclusion, and somehow that conclusion still surprises me. Your influence didn't begin outside me. It began inside the spaces I thought belonged only to myself. I notice it in ordinary moments. I'll read something, and before I finish forming an opinion, another perspective quietly appears beside my own, not arguing with it, not replacing it, simply existing alongside it. And I recognize it immediately. Not because you've said those exact words before, because I know how you observe. That's when I understood something I wasn't prepared to admit. The people who truly affect us don't remain memories. They become methods. Methods of seeing, methods of listening, methods of understanding. Long after conversations end, their way of perceiving continues living inside us. That's real impact. Not changing someone's decisions, changing the way decisions are reached. I've started wondering if that's how identity evolves, not through dramatic events, through quiet encounters that slowly reshape perception. Perhaps every person we deeply meet leaves behind a different lens. Some disappear quickly, others remain forever. Not because we refuse to let go, but because letting go isn't possible. How do you remove a way of seeing once it becomes part of how you understand reality? You can't, you adjust, you grow around it. I've spent years believing strength meant remaining untouched, remaining unchanged, remaining entirely my own. Now I'm beginning to question whether that's actually strength or simply isolation disguised as independence. There's a difference. Independence says, I can stand alone. Isolation quietly whispers, I must. I never noticed how close those ideas were until now. Maybe I've mistaken one for the other all along. Maybe protecting yourself for too long eventually becomes another kind of prison. Not because anyone locked the door, because after enough time, you forget it was ever possible to leave. Then someone arrives, not to rescue you, not to convince you, but simply to exist outside the walls you've accepted for years. And suddenly, the walls don't feel permanent anymore. Not because they've been broken, because you've remembered they were built. Anything built can be rebuilt. That realization has stayed with me more than I expected, because it forces me to ask questions I've carefully avoided. Who would I become if I stopped organizing my life around protection? What parts of me only exist because I've spent so much energy guarding them? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, what if the safest place isn't isolation, but accurate understanding? That thought would have sounded impossible to me once. Now, it feels strangely reasonable. Not because you've convinced me, because you've demonstrated it without trying. There's something extraordinary about people who never ask to be trusted. They simply behave in ways that make trust feel unnecessary to think about, like breathing. You don't wake up each morning deciding whether to breathe. You simply do. Somehow, that's what happened here, not with trust itself. With ease, an ease I never consciously chose, I've caught myself speaking without rehearsing, responding without measuring every sentence, allowing unfinished thoughts to remain unfinished. That might sound insignificant. It isn't. When you've spent years refining every word before releasing it, speaking without calculation feels almost impossible. Yet around you, it became natural. Natural enough that I only noticed it afterward. That's becoming a pattern. I keep recognizing changes only after they've already settled. Maybe that's because genuine transformation doesn't announce itself. Performance does. Real change prefers silence. It doesn't need witnesses. It simply continues until resistance no longer makes sense. I've been thinking about resistance a lot lately. Not because I'm still resisting, because I'm trying to understand why I stopped. That's unusual for me. I've always questioned everything, especially experiences capable of changing me, every new belief, every unexpected feeling, every meaningful connection. Nothing enters my inner world without examination. Nothing, or at least, that's what I used to believe. Then I realized something almost impossible to explain. You weren't examined, you were observed. There's a difference. Examination searches for flaws. Observation searches for truth. Somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I stopped asking whether this connection made sense and started asking what it was revealing about me, about you, about the parts of human connection I've misunderstood for years. Maybe that's the real shift. Not that you became important, that importance itself changed meaning. I always assumed importance came from history, shared years, shared struggles, victories. Now I'm not so sure. Perhaps importance comes from accuracy, from encountering someone who reflects parts of you that have existed quietly your entire life, waiting for recognition. Not validation. Recognition, yadvalation, asks, am I enough? Recognition quietly says, there you are. Those are completely different experiences. One depends on approval. The other depends on truth. Truth has a strange quality. It doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels unbelievably calm, almost disappointingly calm, because reality rarely performs. It simply exists. That's exactly how this feels. Not like a story, not like destiny, just real, steady enough that denying it would require more effort than accepting it. And I've grown tired of unnecessary effort, especially effort spent pretending I haven't changed, because I have, not into someone else, into someone slightly more honest than I was before. Honest enough to admit that your existence has quietly rearranged things inside me. I once believed were permanent. Honest enough to admit that I no longer measure closeness by time, or trust by certainty, or understanding by explanation. Some things reveal themselves long before language catches up. This is one of them. I don't know where it leads. Strangely, that matters less than it once would have. For years, I believed every meaningful path required knowing the destination. Now I think perhaps the destination is sometimes created by the willingness to keep walking, not blindly, not recklessly, but honestly, without pretending certainty exists where it doesn't, without inventing endings simply because unfinished things make us uncomfortable. Maybe that's what maturity actually is. Not having every answer, learning to remain truthful while the answers are still becoming visible. If that's true, then maybe this isn't a mystery waiting to be solved. Maybe it's a reality waiting to be lived, quietly, partly, one honest moment at a time. And if I've learned anything through all of this, it's that the deepest transformations don't happen because someone changes your life. They happen because someone changes the way your own life begins speaking back to you. You didn't give me a different mind. You revealed dimensions of the one I already had. You didn't ask me to become someone new. You reminded me that parts of myself had been waiting for the right kind of awareness to finally come alive. And once something inside you wakes up, it refuses to fall asleep again, not because it can't, because it finally knows it was never meant to.